Many thanks for choosing us. This afternoon, there are concerns about the increasing number of schools under trees and sheds, the declining budgetary allocation for basic education, the lack of JHS in 26% of basic schools, and the poor quality of learning outcomes, which has been identified as the main drivers behind the demand for private basic education. The Africa Education Watch is recommending, among other things, the need for government to increase investment in public basic education to 50% of the education sector expenditure, secure reliable funding to construct the 5,403 schools under trees within the projected 5-year period, construct a net of 1,000 JHS each year to eliminate primary schools without JHS by 2025, and review the current capping of the GET fund to free funds for basic education infrastructure. To advocate for and participate in ending this conundrum, the Africa Education Watch, in partnership with the Coalition Against the Privatization and Commercialization of Education, with support from Oxfam International, is implementing the Education Spike project. It is aimed at promoting investment in public education to improve quality public education. And joining me in the studio to understand the situation on the ground and the campaign at hand is Kofi Asare, who is Executive Director of Africa Education Watch. Good to see you, Kofi.
Hi,
so before we even talk about this campaign, I want us to understand the gravity of the situation we're dealing with.
Well, we have a situation where Ghana has a constitutional obligation to ensure that all children of school-going age enroll and complete the full course of basic education through the FQ provision in our constitution. Unfortunately, due to the dwindling quality of public basic education, you find that about 30% of Ghanaian children are still enrolled in private schools. And if you ask why Ghanaian children or parents of Ghanaian children prefer to enroll their children in private schools, they tell you that they are not satisfied about the learning outcomes in the public sector, to the extent that low-income earners who are earning lower than 1,000 Ghana cedis, 800 Ghana cedis, are still encouraged to find money and enroll their children in makeshift private schools, because they believe that a makeshift private school has quality than a formal, well-organized public basic school. The issues we are raising are these. If the state has an obligation to provide free, compulsory, universal basic education of relevant quality that produces relevant learning outcomes, it must be delivered and delivered well, such that that policy benefits all Ghanaians, and not be delivered in such a manner that only the poor who do not have money to access private education will benefit from that policy, because both the poor and the rich are being taxed, and our taxes being used to provide FQ. So there shouldn't be any reason why, especially the poor, will not be encouraged to subscribe to FQ on the basis that FQ has no quality, bearing in mind that their taxes are being used to finance FQ.
Okay. What are the dangers of everybody wanting to have a taste of private education, leaving the public schools just there, nobody attending?
The dangers are that poor people will be exposed to the challenges of raising funds which they may not be able to come by to access quality education. The danger is that we get to a point where we privatize quality in our educational system, i.e., the only way there's an assurance of quality learning outcomes in basic education is that you need to attend a private school. When that happens, the poorest of the poor, bear in mind that about 10 million Ghanaians cannot afford $1 a day. So when that happens, the poorest of the poor would be left, unattended to in respect of demanding their right to quality basic education, and will be widening the inequality gap existing between the rich and then the poor. Every society that is not able to provide quality social services for the poor is not worth the salt, because all these provisions of free, compulsory, universal basic education, free senior high school, and other social interventions meant to provide for the right to education, among others, are mainly relevant because the interest of the poor must be catered for in a democracy.
What is your recommendation to government? Because I realize that you have a number of recommendations you think government can go through to actually resolve these issues.
Yeah, before we get to the recommendations are hinged on 3 key issues. Okay. The first issue is the declining budgetary allocation for basic education. Let's get it straight. There's no way any government can prioritize basic education without its prioritization manifesting in its wallet. Your priority is where your cash goes to. We have a situation in this country where, as far back as 2008, basic education was enjoying 55% of the education sector's expenditure. Now, 10 years after, in 2008, basic education's share of the education sector expenditure reduced from 55% in 2008 to 37%. That is about 18 percentage points decline in basic education. Since then, basic education's share of the education sector expenditure has been reducing. Secondary education share has increased from about 9% in 2008 to close to 28% as we speak. So the challenge we have is that we keep reducing basic education share of the education budget. Now, what is happening as a result of this reduction, or what is the outcome of this persistent reduction in investment in basic education? What is happening is that today we have 26% of our primary schools not having junior high schools. I'm talking about 4,000 primary schools have no junior high schools. So if you are a student in a school like Butokub DA Primary and you complete primary school, you are likely to complete school and not have a junior school to enroll in, You are dropping out, or you need to go and find money and pay for private junior high school. In the absence of money, you drop out. That is one. 2, in many communities, especially in rural and peri-urban communities, children are walking miles, 15 miles in and out to school. If you go to Kofi Krom in Amenfi Central, just to go to school. As girls walk 7 miles in and out, 14 miles to school every day, the tendency of them dropping out is high. That is why we have up to 20% of children who are enrolling in kindergarten 1 not completing junior high school 3. All these are outcomes of reducing or declining funding or investment for basic education. The final one is the issue of schools under trees.
Yeah.
What do we know? What we know is that according to the Ministry of Education, there are 5,403 schools presently taking place under trees and sheds. Obviously, these environments are not environments that can guarantee any quality teaching and learning. So we are happy that there's an effort by government to eliminate these schools under trees. But the point I want to make is that we have the issue of schools under trees today because over the past decades, we have continued to reduce basic education share of the education sector expenditure, meaning we are reducing the ability of the Ghana Education Service, GES, assemblies to develop or build more basic schools. And that is why we are having about 5,403 schools taking place under trees today. Now, what can we do about this? Government launched a program together with the Vacu Trust Fund to build 5,403 schools under trees, to replace, schools to replace the schools under trees.
Under trees.
It's almost about a year now. So far as we are concerned, only 2% of the funding required has been secured. Out of 3.5 billion required to undertake this project in the next 5 years, which means that we are building about 1,000 a year. Only 2% of the funding is actually secured, and that can build only about 16. We are nowhere. It's a drop in the bucket. So we want to call on government to demonstrate a commitment to eliminate all schools under trees in the next 5 years by putting cash in that wallet, so that the 3.5 billion cedis required to eliminate these schools under trees is provided, and schools under trees eliminated within the next 5 years. Second, we need cash to ensure that every primary school in Ghana has a junior high school.
Okay.
And it is only through consistent increase in the capex expenditure of the Ministry of Education that we can achieve this.
Okay.
What is happening? The Ministry of Finance has capped GET Fund. The capping means that up to only about a third of what should have come to GET Fund is now coming to GET Fund. More than 2/3 is going to other sectors for reallocation.
Okay.
Because of this, instead of, for instance, about 4 billion accruing to GET Fund for allocation, only 1.2, 1.3 is accruing. Okay. Even the 1.4 that accrued this year, that was allocated this year, 60% of it went into the payment of debt, servicing of debt. Only 40% of 1.4 billion was available for allocation. It means that we need to review the capping act, which has capped, among others, the GET fund, and relax it a bit so that at least we can cap it at half and release some about half of what is currently capped to finance basic education infrastructure. Children will be relieved that in the next 2-3 years, they will be seeing more infrastructure springing up. Because guess what? In the whole of 2020, government built only 240 junior high schools and 100 primary schools. That is so low. If we continue at the pace that we are currently building now, it will take us 26 years to ensure that every primary school has a junior high school. And
by that time, we may be having more challenges.
The child cannot wait. We want all 4,000 primary schools that do not have junior high schools to have an opportunity of getting junior high schools within the next 5 years. The children in these communities, the parents in these communities are Ghanaians, and they have the right to progressive education, not to an education where you complete primary school and you don't have anywhere to go, or you are left at the mercy of private junior high school, or walk miles to school and drop out.
We're still trying to get the Ministry of Education to join this conversation. At least they have answers to why, after a year of launching the building of schools, turning schools under trees into structures have not been done, and other issues affecting them. But thankfully, Dr. Clement Apak, who is Deputy Ranking Member on the Education Committee of Parliament and MP for Bosa South, has joined us. Doc, I'm grateful for your time. Now, there are genuine concerns by well-meaning Ghanaians for government to deal with schools under trees and to also deal with the declining budgetary allocation for basic education and actually generally improve the pre-tertiary education. It has been something on the table for quite some time now. Unfortunately, we as a country have not made much progress in dealing with some of these problems. As a deputy ranking member on the Education Committee of Parliament, do you know why we haven't resolved these challenges, especially schools under trees?
Well, let me say good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to viewers and listeners. My good friend Kofi Asare, for the fantastic work that he and his institution have been doing in support of improving teaching and learning in the country. I have seen a copy of the brief, and I couldn't agree more. Indeed, all the issues highlighted are issues that should occupy the attention of every player in the educational sector. It is the case that we ought to do more as a nation to ensure that we provide the needed facilities and infrastructure and the requisite teachers to improve access, because we tend to forget that just putting up the school building itself does not improve access. We need to get the teachers there, and we need to make sure that they have the requisite teaching and learning material. If you look at the issue of preschools in terms of KGs, it is very shameful. I know several.
All right, so Dr. Clement Apak is actually trying to paint a picture of what the situation is currently. If you go to basic schools, especially those that happen under trees, and of course he's agreeing with Kofi Asamoah, who have put together, his outfit has put together a document that suggests that we need a lot more to end these schools under trees. Is Dr. Clement Apak back? All right, so as we wait for him to join us back, so I want you to tell me about the Education Spike campaign. What is it all about?
The Education Spike campaign is a campaign that seeks to tell the whole world that education is a right, it's a public good, and countries must invest in public education. Education Spike recognizes that there's private education and the threats it poses to public education, because most governments become laxic. They become laid back, and then they watch the private sector, do the job that they're supposed to do. In this country, for instance, in Greater Accra region, in districts like South, You go there and 70% of the schools there are private schools. In Greater Accra, virtually every district has about 70% of schools being private. The meaning is that government over the years has reneged, has laid back on its commitments, and rather, instead of looking at the private sector as playing a complementary role, has left the development of or access to education, education delivery to private schools, and government rather doing a little. So government rather is supporting private schools in areas like Greater Accra and Greater Kumasi, which should be the reverse.
Yeah.
So education spike seeks to bring government attention to the fact that even though you have failed to build enough schools in urban areas, for instance, the fact that you have an obligation to provide free, compulsory, universal basic education to your citizenry, you are still obliged to ensure that every community in Greater Accra region, be it an urban or a peri-urban community, is entitled to have access to a public school. So if you live in Malam and you don't have access to a public school, we are telling government that the people in Malam deserve a public school because they are both urban rich and then urban poor people there.
Yeah.
And the urban poor should not be exposed to the economic factors that will exclude them from accessing private education. For that matter, there must be public schools in all communities. If you go to communities like East Legon, the only public school in East Legon is Biology.
Okay.
Until you get to the other one at Jirgano. If you go to Oyibi area, the only public school in Oyibi is one, Oyibi Presby. The school actually is running a shift system.
Okay.
It runs morning and afternoon. There's a head teacher for morning and then head teacher for afternoon. Okay? All these are being experienced because our government have not planned over time against or ahead of the development of cities. So cities have grown, and this special, the development of cities have overtaken the planning for social infrastructure, especially schools.
And our population keeps increasing.
Exactly. And so now government is finding it difficult, or government is unwilling to now buy land, which has now become expensive, and build schools in these communities, and has left the job for private sector to do. But we are saying that no, you cannot sit down and say that because there's no land in Medina, you are not going to build any more schools in Medina. No, you understand? So we are saying that look for land, buy land. Don't buy your normal 2 acres, 3 acres, 4 acres. You need to build a school with a big school park as you normally have. But let's be innovative and appreciate the fact that the value of land is very, very expensive in urban areas. So you can build a school on, let's say, 1 or 2 plots of land. So that people who are poor in these communities, who do not have the means of accessing private schools in these communities, can have their children educated, so that they can break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. At least their children shouldn't be poor as they live in kiosks and shacks in urban Ghana. That is what Education Spike is about. Okay,
so thankfully Dr. Park is back on Zoom. Dr. Park, you were earlier making a critical point as to why we're still here.
Yes, I was making the point about the inadequacy of kindergartens. And I was making the point that there are several primary schools, as rightly captured by Africa Education Watch, across the length and breadth of this country, who do not have KGs to complement. And I think I was citing the example of rural areas where parents tend to be farmers, and how the lack of the KGs makes it very difficult for children to be enrolled very early on in good time. And there are also many of these communities where they don't have primary schools at all. And the distance between the communities and the nearest primary school sometimes is about 5 kilometers. And so you can imagine the anxiety of parents and the need to protect their wards, and how that then affects their ability and willingness to enroll 4 or 5-year-olds in a school.
There seemed to be a terrible...
that is 5 kilometers away from where they think we ought to tackle.
Okay.
Education and healthcare are usually dominant in terms of the budgetary allocations. The question then becomes, what else do we need to do to ensure that the budgetary allocations are not just increased, but that there is a specific policy direction to invest in the provision of structures at the basic level. And I think that is an area that we ought to increase the debate as we are looking at the laying of the 2022 budget and what government is going to propose.
All right, so Dr. Clement Apak is also making that point there, but it all comes down to the fact that government must improve or increase allocation for that sector, because funding will resolve a lot of the issues that we are talking about. So in November, the Minister of Finance will be going to Parliament to specifically, what do you want to see in the budget with regards to pre-tertiary education?
Indeed, everything we are discussing boils down to the availability of cash and its efficient utilization.
Definitely.
We are part of the Civil Society Budget Coalition. Partners of Education Spike campaign have actually met to submit our position to the Ministry of Finance in respect of the upcoming budget. The most important input we made for the education sector is that the capping of GET fund must be relaxed. We need, if we are going to still cap GET fund, we should relax it and at least release half of the capped revenue to GET fund. Because if we don't release some of the capped revenue to GET fund, this is what is going to happen. We are just going to keep borrowing and borrowing at a high interest rate. And then our propensity to eliminate our infrastructure deficits will be extended. So we are appealing to the finance minister that it is conscionable that you cap certain revenues with the purpose of redistributing revenues among other important sectors. But education sector suffers a serious setback in respect of infrastructure, where we need at least 10,000 school buildings, 5,000 in junior high schools alone, and 5,000 to take care of schools existing in the trees. And this is immediate because attaining sustainable development goal 4 and ensuring that all children who enroll complete the full course of basic education, not just primary schools, with the relevant learning outcomes, cannot be possible by 2030 if they continue to learn under tree sheds and continue to walk for miles to access junior high school after completing primary 6. So let's relax the capping regime and free at least half of the currently capped funds from GET fund to the education sector. And as we release this cap, we should earmark this extra allocation specifically for the construction of basic schools in communities that lack junior high schools and communities that education takes place under trees, sheds, and dilapidated structures. We hope to see the finance minister make a review of the Capping Act when he goes to Parliament later in November. In November.
Dr. Park, if you're still there for me, the finance minister will soon present the budget to Parliament. And I want to find out, what's the role of your committee and the plenary as a whole in ensuring that some drastic measures are taken to improve the current situation?
Well, very quickly, let me say that the emphasis on basic education is welcome. We have tended to forget about the challenges at the basic level with the advent of the free senior school policy.
Yep.
At the same time that we are so focused on the free senior school, our basic system is suffering greatly. I mean, you know the issue of textbooks, but that is for another day. I would want to agree with Mr. Asare. In fact, the minority side, we have already filed a motion, the private members' motion, calling on government to decap GET fund, rightly because the capping has not helped in terms of the level of resources that flows into the GET fund pot, that then allows for GET fund to engage in the kinds of activities that Mr. Asare and I would like to see, to build more structures for KGs, for schools that have primary schools with their KGs, and to build junior high schools for schools that have primary schools with our junior high schools, because these all affect the progress of education. Those who have access to a KG, going to primary 1, they already have the basics, and it makes it easier. Those who have access to a JHS, when they finish primary 6 and that JHS is in their community, it is easier for them to continue rather than telling them to go 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10 miles to another community to continue. Many of them will drop out. So we are in support of that effort, and we have already filed a private members motion. But you see, Aisha, the truth is that government itself has not had its priorities right in terms of what it promised to do. And I just give you a quick example regarding the provision of cages. If we were to look at the MP manifesto for 2020, page 5, at item 10, it says, ensure that kindergarten places are available for all 4-year-old children in the country. This is captured in their manifesto. And yet they did not make provision to ensure that this manifesto promise was achieved. So we are waiting to see what is going to happen. At the committee level, they would bring what we call their estimates, both the ministry and its agencies. Usually matters
So that's Dr. Clement Apak there. We seem to have challenges with his internet, but of course he says that they're in support of government improving funding for completion of some of the schools or turning schools under trees into structures, and also dealing with some of the challenges. So we'll be looking forward to see what happens in Parliament. I must say that the Education Ministry says it wants to study the documents presented to it by the Africa Education Watch before it can make any comments. But I want to find out from you, how do you intend to push government and other stakeholders to actually get this done? Because you know this conversation has been on for a long time, but we still haven't achieved enough in this regard.
I think when it comes to government's priorities, I am clear in my mind, and the group is clear in our minds, that government priorities, as mentioned in their manifesto, aligns with the things we are talking about, except that we need to have a difficult conversation. The Ministry of Education appreciates that it is cash-strapped when it comes to CAPEX, capital expenditure to build schools. It appreciates that, yes, there is money through the 1.5 billion loan that we securitize part of GET Fund to obtain to expand infrastructure, especially in the senior high schools. But they also agree that there is very little money available to build basic schools. That is why last year, in 2020, for instance, we built only 240 or so junior high schools and only 100 primary schools. And so they agree in principle that there is little money. Now, why are we having this challenge? Because of the capping of the revenue. If 4 billion was to accrue to GET Fund every year, as we pay taxes and make contributions to NHIL and GET Fund, now GET Fund is receiving only 1.4 billion. It means GET Fund is losing about close to 3 billion, every year to other sectors because of the capping regime. And so every practitioner in the education sector would have wished that the capping regime would have been relaxed so that more resources would be freed to enable the Ministry of Education embark on more expansive infrastructural expansion programs at the basic level. So the ministry will definitely be happy to have the capping. But of course, there's a policy of it because the capping is a decision by the Ministry of Finance. And so it will be difficult for you to openly see the Minister of Education disagreeing with the Minister of Finance about the capping of resources. But what it has done is that out of 4 or 5 billion that should have inured to GET Fund for infrastructure, only 1.4 is coming because of the capping, and the rest is being taken to other sectors. We believe that investing in basic education is the only way every government or any government should demonstrate that basic education is a priority. Basic education is the raw material. Secondary education is the factory. The quality of the raw material determines the quality of the finished product. And so we need to walk the talk, open the wallet, and invest in basic education and ensure that 50%, at least 50% of the sector's expenditure is spent at the basic level, because without that, you cannot achieve the quality.
Have you submitted some copies to the Ministry of Education, GES, and all the people who matter in resolving these issues?
We have developed a lot of engagement tools. We have shared our documentaries on the lack of junior high schools in 4,000 junior high schools with the minister. I have personally said it to the minister. So all the positions we are holding are positions that the ministry is fully much aware. But we are going to also directly engage the Minister of Education together with the All African Students Union, members of the coalition, teacher unions, etc. We're going to have a meeting with the minister and then discuss formally these positions. But they are aware of all this because we are communicating not only through reports, but through documentaries, through flyers and all that. And we have shared them, and we keep sharing them with the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Finance, and all other people in policy-making positions to appreciate that we need to do something about the capping of GET funding.
All right. I'm grateful for your time, Kofi Asare, and thanks so much for the good work you're doing.